Welcome to Who Wrote That Up For You, a daily podcast that shines a light on the American justice system and its role in empowering the powerful to take from you. The justice system is the only branch of your government where an individual, rather than the collective, can make the system act for you. It puts power in the individual's hands, but it's broken and being used against you at a time when you need it most.
Welcome to Who Wrote That Up For You. I am Sonia Ebron, co-founder at Courtroom 5.
And I am Deborah Sloan, the other co-founder at Courtroom 5.
Powerful show lined up for you today. In a few moments, we will speak with Kristin Henning. Kristin is the Blume Professor of Law at Georgetown Law. She's also the director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic there and the author of Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth. And so we will be interested to delve into that subject in just a moment. Before we get there, Deborah, what is on your mind today?
The Dobbs decision back in June of last year, the infamous now Dobbs decision on abortion, was based primarily on a question of whether the 14th Amendment to the Constitution provided a right to abortion, and the U.S. Supreme Court said basically no. And but a recent judge recently basically in court stated that there could be a right to abortion in the 13th Amendment, which is the amendment that freed the slaves. And she based that on a Northwestern University School of Law professor's a paper back in 1990 that basically, and she read part of the paper in court that says when women are compelled to carry and bear children, they are subjected to involuntary servitude in violation of the 13th Amendment. And I was like, wow, what a great what a great analysis, or what a great take on that whole abortion thing. And I'm wondering, because the Supreme Court, I mean, the question was really very narrow on the Dobbs decision about the 14th Amendment. We're only going to look at this amendment, but they didn't look at the others. And so I thought that was very. I agree with that. You know, that there's so many reasons why that is a true statement that we need to. I think we need to look at it further as a country.
That's extraordinary. You know, so many of the issues we have around policing and criminal justice and abortion and all of that stuff, in my mind, at least, the common denominator there is whether or not people have bodily autonomy.
Right.
You know, you have a right to the use of your own body. You wouldn't think in this 21st century that we'd be even talking about that. Right. You know what I'm saying? But we do. And I'm reminded, that Kansas fight last year over abortion had to do with the Kansas Supreme Court earlier finding a constitutional right to bodily autonomy, which gave women the right to have an abortion. And so the fight last year was a referendum to overthrow that decision, by law. And of course it lost. And I'm so happy about that. I have some friends who went to war over that in Kansas. And so, this is something that we really cannot talk about a whole lot when it comes to the law if you don't have bodily autonomy, for everybody, right? Anyway, I'm not going to I could be here all day on that. So I appreciate you bringing that up. But it's certainly a root for what we're trying to do and what I think a lot of other people in the justice space are trying to work on.
Exactly.
At any rate, at Courtroom 5, we believe the courts belong to the people, in particular to the people who use them. And we, the people, are coming to claim our courts. So if you are in court without a lawyer, or you need to sue someone and can't find a lawyer to represent you, get yourself over to courtroom5.com. Try a limited version of our services for free, and we hope to provide some relief for you there. At this time, it is my great pleasure to welcome onto the show Professor Kristin Henning, again, the Blume Professor of Law at Georgetown Law, director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic there, and the author of Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth. Thank you, Professor Kristin Henning, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Fantastic. Let's dive into the criminalization of Black youth, Black and brown youth. Tell us what that is. What does criminalization mean?
Well, I use that term, or I think the criminalization operates probably in three critical ways. One is the true criminalization of those things, those behaviors, those activities that every single one of us participated in as a child, right? And so think of it this way, right? What do we know about teenagers? That we know that they're impulsive, reactive, emotional. I like to say teenagers are fairness fanatics, right? Deeply loyal to their friends and to their loved ones, right? And anything that hints at unjust is a problem. Teenagers are sensation seekers, risk takers. This notion of peer influence is absolutely not a myth at all. Teenagers do what their friends do or what they think their friends are doing, right? And they often make bad decisions and aren't great at strategic long-term thinking, and they care more about the immediate gratification rather than the long-term consequences. So what does all of that mean? It means that kids, do stupid stuff, right? They get into arguments, right? They, test the boundaries. They talk back to adults, right? They experiment with drugs and alcohol and sex. That's what teenagers do. And that's what, really we all did. And if we didn't do those things, we really wouldn't grow up to be the independent, courageous adults that we are. And so when I talk about the criminalization of normal adolescence, I'm talking about the ways in which those everyday behaviors are treated as a sin, if you will, are treated as criminal by Black and brown children in particular, right? I'm also talking about roughhousing with your friends on the beach or playing the dozens, with a friend, at school. I'm talking also about everyday play, like Tamir Rice, right? Playing with a toy gun in a park. That's what I mean by the criminalization of normal adolescent behaviors. But, I also said this all operates in three ways. Another way that I think we have to really understand this criminalization of Black youth and really Black and brown youth is the over-policing and hyper-surveillance of Black and brown children. And by this, I mean that there are now generations of Black children who have grown up under the constant eye, both of police officers in a blue uniform, but also, the rest of us, civilians, who are afraid of and expecting, Black children to act in a certain way. So in terms of police in a blue uniform, in many Black and brown neighborhoods, police officers are parked on the street corner, drive through the community at all hours of the day and night, asking young people where they're going, where they're coming from. Police officers are stationed at the front door of schools all across the country, but especially in Black and brown neighborhoods. And then the third way in which this criminalization operates is through truly the dehumanization of Black and brown bodies. Dehumanization is really what allows us to treat people poorly and to act without empathy when other people make mistakes. And so when Black children do commit real crimes, I'm not talking about the normal adolescent behaviors, but when Black children do make mistakes and commit real crimes, we treat them as if they are beyond redemption, right? Whereas when we get annoyed with the recklessness of adolescence, for the most part, we still treat white teenagers with tolerance, with grace, with compassion, with forgiveness. But on the other hand, we treat Black children as if they are violent, irredeemable people, if people at all, right? That's, I think, the heart of dehumanization. We don't see them as human. So we're more likely to prosecute them as if they were an adult. We're more likely to find them guilty, more likely to impose severe sentences like life without the possibility of parole. And we're more likely to send them to solitary confinement.
It's extraordinary. And just a number, I'm thinking about just the path I got to adulthood through, and I'm a bit older, and so perhaps these crises were not as severe, at least at the time. But I cannot imagine I wouldn't have spent significant amount of time in juvenile justice had this criminalization been as present here in Durham, North Carolina, when I was growing up. For sure, things have seemed to get worse. Is there a reason for that? For the worsening of that? What is driving this criminalization of Black youth?
So I think there's a historical through line, right, from the era of, the enslavement of Black and brown folks, when, purported slave, masters, or these folks, property owners, could and did treat Black children like property and beat them if they allegedly got out of line and asserted themselves. And then you sort of fast forward to the era of lynching, and lynching was used on children like Emmett Till to keep them in place, to keep them in line. And we have to think about, the lynching of Emmett Till came right on the heels of Brown versus Board of Education, this effort to integrate schools. And so it was far less about, this, what we now know as a false claim that Emmett Till was whistling at a white woman, and more about all of the effort to keep Black children separate and segregated. So, look, out of the pools, you can't date our women, you can't be in our schools. So that was the historical, very explicit ways in which we kept Black children in place. Now today, we when that's outlawed, right? Some of the more explicit forms of racism and discrimination are outlawed. We pivot to the criminalization of Black children as another way to keep Black children in control during those adolescent years, before they have an opportunity to assert themselves and become productive leaders who have access to resources in the United States. So I think a lot of it has been intentional, and those intentional narratives that are used to justify institutions like the enslavement of Black folks and lynching and segregation, those narratives now live on in our subconscious, right? So I think about the super predator era of the 1990s, right? There was a temporary uptick in crime in the 1990s, and Black children became the target of this war, on crime and on poverty. And the myth put forth was that the Black child was the super predator, and they were going to rape, maim, and kill all of America by the year 2000. And that was, in the mid 1990s. We know that never happened. Within a year, right, of that super predator myth, it had to be withdrawn. But so you ask the question, how does this happen now? We're living off of the subconscious narrative that has just grown and grown and grown, such that many people in our country fear Black children, and even Black and brown children. I mean, Black and brown adults fear Black children.
Right, exactly. You remind me of the Black codes after the end of slavery, where there were laws against loitering, there were laws against not having a job, and they were specifically targeting Black people in order to effectively re-enslave them. And I'm thinking about now targeting the absolutely normal adolescent behaviors as somehow criminal here, even if we're only doing that in practice, as another way of trying to shackle these youth. What are the impacts on adolescent development of being targeted in that way?
Oh, absolutely. There is a growing body of research documenting the extraordinary psychological trauma that policing imposes on Black youth at one of the most important times in their lives, these adolescent years. The research shows that Black youth who have been the target of excessive stops and frisks by the police, or who live in heavily surveilled neighborhoods, who attend heavily surveilled schools, report high rates of fear, anxiety, depression, hopelessness. They really become sort of hyper vigilant, meaning that they're always on guard, not trusting police officers. And that distrust of police officers carries over to other state actors like teachers, counselors, and other state actors who might, be allies for them. Many times young people who are over policed and in hyper surveilled communities become detached and withdrawn and can't concentrate in schools. And so, another, piece of evidence to support, sort of this traumatic effects of over policing and hyper surveillance is that young people who live with a heavy police presence and frequent stops and frisk have significantly greater odds of sleep deprivation, right? Or low quality sleep. And, we all know that children who don't get a good night's sleep can't, perform well in school, can't engage well with adults, right? Can't resolve conflicts when they're emotionally agitated, and not alert. Also, what's really powerful about the research is that trauma occurs not only, from being the direct target of police aggression, but also from witnessing or hearing about police aggression from family, friends, and someone who's close to them. So having to worry about, coming to school or walking in a park and becoming the next victim of some police violence is in and of itself a source of stress. Even watching, the killing of George Floyd on television, or, Tyree, Nichols, all of it, right? It has a lasting impact on the psychological well-being of children. And then, finally, really one of the most important ways that policing affects adolescents, right, is in adolescent identity formation, which is really just a fancy way of saying that frequent police interventions have an effect on the child's sense of who they are, who they can become, right? And how they fit into larger society. So young people who really have negative experiences with police early in life really begin to question the fairness and the legitimacy of policing as an institution, and question whether or not it's even worth it, to participate in the mainstream society.
And I'm thinking all of that combined has got to certainly lead me to a greater propensity for violence, right? The stress, the isolation from potential allies and my teachers, the guidance counselors, having to go to school with essentially a police officer there at the door, right? When I've seen them brutalizing other people, for an adolescent has just got to make you not okay.
That's
Right?
absolutely right. And most people don't get it. So I love, that's exactly right. And the research confirms it, that actually over policing actually increases crime and not reduces crime. And so it's counterintuitive for most people. We have been sold the narrative that the only way to keep schools safe and the community safe is to police, right? Is through traditional law enforcement strategies, when in fact the research shows just the opposite, right? Wow. That we need, a more public health strategy for public safety and school safety, right? Instead of these traditional law enforcement, approaches, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's it's almost diabolical. You over police community, particular it's youth. You drive up crime rates, justifying over policing of, we've seen this over and over. It is ridiculous. Well, let me ask, for a parent or anyone wanting to lend some protection to these children, we're talking about kids here. What do you do if your kid has been arrested, for instance? What tips would you have for a parent or anyone who is seeing kids abused by police?
Yeah, so I love your show. It's, you know, geared towards folks who, you know, if you don't have a lawyer, tune in and get some advice. I have to do this though. I have to say, please go find a lawyer. You know, I gotta say it. You know, and particularly in juvenile court, right? Because many juvenile courts across the country, really quite intentionally encourage parents and children not to ask for a lawyer. Right. And the argument is, you know, this is just a rehabilitative space. And so there's, you know, little harm that can be done. And what folks don't realize is, you know, the immediate consequences of detention, long-term incarceration, the risk that your child will be adjudicated delinquent without due process of law is really, really heightened. And, you know, when juvenile court started, historically, the first juvenile court started without lawyers under this ideal that this was just the benign judge who was going to redirect and you know, provide counseling and guidance for that young person. And it turned out not to be true. It turned out to be a kangaroo court, right? Yeah. And finally, the Supreme Court of the United States, not until, you know, 1967, declared that children had a right to a lawyer. So that was my long way of saying, please demand that the court, you know, appoint you a lawyer. But, you know, that aside, you know, part of what, you know, a parent, you know, needs to do is to record whatever they can record with the cell phone. Start there, right? You know, find witnesses, find, you know, other young people who were present at the time, right? Talk to neighbors who may have seen the arrest. And all of that is to provide information and resources to give to the lawyer who's going to advocate for that child. And I think people don't do that, you know, enough. I also say to parents, your natural gut instinct as a parent is to say to your kid, you know what, son, if you did something wrong, go ahead, tell the truth, you know, fess up. And whatever you do, don't do it. Don't do it. Resist the urge. The police officers will try to, you know, for those of you who watched Ava DuVernay's film, When They See Us, you know, there's a, you know, I believe, you know, the segments in that documentary that help us understand the pressure that parents are under from police to get their kids to confess is real today. It is not a relic of the past. So whatever you do, even when you're mad at your child, just, you know, tell them not to say anything to the police and that will get help. The other tip that I really have for parents, and especially parents who really love their children and want resources, they are fed the lie that juvenile courts are designed to provide mental health services, treatment, you know, tutoring, all the things. Please don't do it. Don't do it. Let you know, go to your local Department of Human Services. You know, if your kid needs drug treatment, go to, you know, local addictions prevention recovery. Do some Googling. Call your local defense attorney's office and find out what resources you can get for your child short of the court system. The court system is not designed, despite the myth, to provide those services. And even if it were, even if there's a local court that is particularly useful in doling out services to our children, you don't want the stigma and the punitive oversight that comes with that. And then the final thing I would say for your kid who gets placed in detention or in, you know, some other correctional facility, visit often and ask a lot of questions. Yeah. Ask questions. Get the kids to tell you about their day-to-day experience in these facilities.
Yeah, I can imagine all that goes on there. That is amazing. Let me just dive into one of these issues. You mentioned that children have a right to a lawyer in these situations. I don't think many people understand that. And so, you know, does it matter at all what your income is or your family's income?
Oh, great question. So when the Supreme Court said in 1967 that children have a right to lawyers, that means court-appointed lawyers, right? And I know there's the fear that court-appointed lawyers don't do right by children. And look, it is true that in many, and in some, I will say some jurisdictions, that, unpaid court-appointed lawyers don't do enough. But I got to say, there is a real movement of front. And as you indicated, I am at Georgetown Law School, and we, in partnership, the Georgetown Juvenile Justice Clinic, in partnership with the GALT Center, which is formerly the National Juvenile Defender Center, have done massive work over the last, 10, 20 years to raise the level of practice among defense attorneys across the United States. And we are seeing the fruit of that. Right. And so there are resources available. And so what I would say to parents is, one, demand a lawyer at court. You are entitled to a lawyer regardless of your income. And children, guess what? Forget the parents' income. Make the argument that children don't have income. Yeah. And it's the children who have a right to a lawyer. Okay. So demand that, and then really know that the squeaky wheel gets the oil, right? You've got to be in regular contact with your child's lawyer. And when the child's lawyer is non-responsive, reach out to the court and say, we need a new lawyer because our lawyer is not responsive. Another strategy is to reach out to the GALT Center, the National Juvenile Defender Center, that I mentioned. You can easily Google them, GAULT Center, GALT Center, and ask to be connected with a lawyer. And they will immediately, wherever state, all 50 states, they can find you someone who you can at least talk to about best practices. So yes, children have a right to a lawyer, and it is the children. It's not the parent's right, but the parent can make sure that happens.
That's such valuable information. Really, really appreciate that, as well as the guidance on not going on to the court for mental health assistance. Obviously, as we discussed earlier, these are often kids with higher anxiety and stress and many other issues going on. They're adolescents. All of them are crazy. I've been one, right? And parents who are stressed themselves trying to get their kids some mental health. It's really important to understand that court is not where you go to get that help. So really appreciate that guidance. I know we're running long here, so I want to just touch on a couple other. I could talk to you all day about this. Really appreciate your knowledge. But let me ask first about the relationship between race and students with disabilities, right? Whether they have cognitive disabilities or some others. How does race influence or interfere with the way the juvenile justice system and police in general treat them?
Yeah, another great question. I have to say that, excuse me, children with disabilities are even more of any race, are more likely to be referred to the criminal legal system for their behaviors. That's number one. Black and brown children with disabilities are even 3 times more likely and to be arrested for their disabilities. So think about this on a couple of levels. Let's just start with youth with disabilities, learning disabilities, emotional disabilities. The reality is police officers and other disciplinary staff, for example, at schools, have very little training on trauma and other common mental health challenges among young people, right? And other learning disabilities. So autism, attention deficit disorder, speech and language disorders, depression, right? Which often flows from some of those learning disabilities, Asperger's syndrome. And so think about autistic children who really have what they call poor executive functioning, which basically means they have, difficulty problem solving, reasoning, difficulty with their working memory, difficulty managing tasks, right? Children with autistic, who are autistic, and children with communication disorders, often have difficulty understanding and processing and responding to what we call who, what, where, when, and why type questions, right? Particularly in rapid order. So a police officer or an adult walks up to a kid, where are you coming from? Where are you going? What are you doing? Why are you out in the hallway? And there's sort of that rapid fire, children with, cognitive processing, difficulties really have a hard time responding to that. Also, children with sensory deficit disorders have real trouble with loud noises, buzzing sounds, physical touch. So a teacher or a counselor walks up and touches a child, with Asperger's syndrome, for example, on the shoulder, or autism on the shoulder, they might really become agitated. So I say all of that to say that's children in general with disabilities often get misinterpreted as aggressive, as threatening, as violent. Now, guess what? You compound that with racial bias, right? And what are the stereotypes about Black and brown children? There's years of research on cognitive biases demonstrating that people are more likely to perceive Black children as more dangerous and violent than they actually are, perceiving Black boys as significantly older than they actually are. In fact, by 4.5 years older than they actually are. Similar research has been done about Black girls, demonstrating that adults like teachers and counselors and police officers are more likely to perceive Black girls as more mature, more knowledgeable about adult topics, less innocent, less in need of protections. They are more likely to perceive both Black boys and girls' facial expressions, innocuous, facial expressions or ambiguous behaviors as violent, aggressive, and threatening. All of this goes into how we respond. So think about that intersection between disabilities, right? Kids with learning disabilities who have a difficult time expressing themselves and who act out of emotion and trauma get perceived through this racially biased lens, right? And so increasing the likelihood that a Black or brown child is going to be arrested or referred to the court system from school.
That is extraordinary. Professor, thank you so much. I want to share link to your website. It's the title of your book, rageofinnocence.com. For, viewers who are interested in delving even more deeply into this subject. Tell us briefly then about the book. I know this is ongoing research on your part and others, but what's the essential subject of the book here?
Absolutely. So the title of the book is The Rage of Innocence: How America Criminalizes Black Youth. And indeed, it talks, and I want to be really clear, it's not an academic text. It is a text meant for, everyday readers, right? Who care about young children, all children, and especially Black and brown children who have been disproportionately, criminalized and demonized. So it's a collection of stories about young people who get criminalized, over-policed, and dehumanized. And I pair that with the research in plain language, research on adolescent development and how Black children have the same developmental features as all children, right? I talk about the ways in which Black children are over-policed and hyper-surveilled. I give the research, the data, again, in plain language. And I talk about solutions. I talk about the school-to-prison pipeline. I talk about the Black family in the era of mass incarceration. I talk about all the ways we can move forward, the criminalization of play, childhood play. So I urge folks to read it. Wherever you sit in society, you have a role to play in the decriminalization of Black children. You have a role to play in getting all of us to treat Black children like children.
I so appreciate that caution for all of us. We have to understand, our ability as a society to maintain is going to depend on these very children. The demographics are changing. If we're criminalizing our youth, we're criminalizing our entire society, and we've got to make a change there. So appreciate your work there, Professor Kristin Henning. We will continue to follow your progress and your process there, and thank you so much for joining us on Who Wrote That Up for You.
Thank you for having me.
That is important work. That is something we've got to spend a lot more time on as a society here. I know we're over time, Deborah, so I definitely want to give you time for the quiz. Tell us the answers to the previous quiz, if you would.
The question was, which of the following is an example of a sham pleading? First of all, there are only on this list of four options. There's only really two, because there are only two that are pleadings. That there's only two possibilities. So a complaint or answering affirmative defenses. So number one, a frivolous complaint, or number four, a weak answer and affirmative defenses. A weak answer is an affirmative defenses does not have to be a sham pleading. It could just be a weak answer and affirmative defenses. Motions are not pleadings, so those don't count. So the only really answer is number one. A frivolous complaint is an example of a sham pleading. And then the next question, today's quiz. Tory was sued by Big Bad Bank for failing to pay a credit card debt. The case is in the discovery stage, and Tory feels that the bank did not respond adequately to her interrogatories. So she moved to compel answers. The bank opposed, stating that the motion should be denied because Tory never asked them for better answers. Does the bank have a point? And we will give you the answer in the next show.
Looking forward to that. Looks like such a trick question, but I am going to see what that answer is. Fantastic. Yeah, really appreciate Professor Henning for sharing that wealth of knowledge on such a critical issue there. Happy to go over our usual time to have that conversation. At any rate, that's all we have for you today. Thanks as always for joining us on Who Wrote That Up For You, and we will see you next time.
Are you feeling beleaguered, angry, or afraid, as if things are spinning out of control and you're powerless to stop them? It's easy to just let things slide and hope they don't get worse. But they often do get worse. The thing is, you're not powerless. Our courts belong to us, and their purpose is to give power to the powerless. Don't let your grievances pile up without redressing them. You can handle this in court. Or, if someone takes you to court, you can take them to school.